fan of campaign finance reform as a general rule. And I'm not a fan of campaign finance reform. One, because it's a complex issue, and there's a lot of like minute, detailed laws over what is or is not legal in terms of campaign finance. But also, it's just a very, very difficult question to answer. And it's why you see this question come up with the Supreme Court regularly. This is something that Bernie Sanders has railed against since he really hit the national stage, right? And trying to overturn Citizens United, which essentially allows for unlimited money to be brought into campaigns so long as it's done in a certain manner. And this gets into all of that sort of like convoluted legalities of it, right? Like, you're only allowed to donate a set amount of money to an individual candidate. You're only allowed to donate a set amount of money to an individual party, right? But if you neither campaign for a party or an individual, but if you campaign like about an issue and you set it up separately, like you can donate however much money you want. This is how we end up with like PACs and super PACs and all kinds of stuff. So it's a difficult concept to go over, and like I said, it's really just not a lot of fun, right? Because if you think about it too hard, it really does make your head hurt, right? And the simple reason that it makes your head hurt, if you think about it, can we all agree that buying an advertisement is essentially free speech, right? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so all those little Super Bowl ads you saw last night, that was an individual company making their own free speech. Okay, free speech is essential to our basic principles as a democracy, therefore free speech is allowed, right? Free speech is not equal. The richer you are, the more ad space that you could buy, therefore the more speech you can afford. Which one then makes free speech not really free anymore because you're paying for it, or you're at least paying for the platform. But additionally, we should recognize that the United States government would benefit significantly from limiting the amount of sort of paid free speech that you see in campaigning specifically, right? So then that becomes the question: at what point can you stop it in order to sort of do what's in the best interest of the United States versus abide by a constitutional provision that's essential to our basic foundations of liberty, right? And so what the argument really hinges on, at least from what I've seen for the most part, is that the argument ultimately really hinges on whether or not corporations can be afforded the same rights as individuals. And so what we end up with as we go through all of this, and it begins to get out of control probably around about the time of television, right? So Dwight Eisenhower is the first one who ever runs a campaign ad on TV. By the 70s, it's a little bit more out of hand. I want to say it was the '68 election, and at the end of when we're done with the class, we'll actually go through some of these different campaign ads, and you'll see. But I want to say it was the '68 election where they literally had a campaign ad where there was a little girl like holding a little flower, and then they nuked her, right? And basically the message was, if you elect this guy as president of the United States, he's going to kill your daughter. Because he's a loose cannon and an idiot, you don't want him having access to nuclear weapons. All right. So we established the FEC, right, which is the Federal Elections Commission. You'll sometimes see that abbreviated as FEC. This is a regulatory agency now that is supposed to oversee the financial aspects of our elections and ensure that money is being or is changing hands in a manner that is equitable. All right. What this does also, we actually create a system where we make it even, or at least we try to make it even, to where we subsidize with federal money campaign finance. So that way the Republican and the Democrat get the same amount of finance. All right, I told you, or we talked about why it was so important for Gary Johnson to get 5%. You remember that conversation? Okay, 5% affords him subsidies. Okay, without that 5%, he can get no subsidies. He does not count as a real party or as a real candidate. Okay, and obviously it's for the next election cycle, right? Like if Gary Johnson had gotten 5%, nobody's going to hand Gary Johnson a check for like $80 million. Okay? Instead, the Libertarian Party would get $80 million to spend for campaigning and whatnot in 2020. All right, so it works for the next cycle. One of the downsides is if you take the federal money, you are then subject to basically federal control over how much money you can spend, and so we don't really do that anymore. One, the candidates can raise more money on their own than what the government will give them, and so if they raise the money themselves, then they're not subject to the limitations that the national government puts on them. All right. That being said, this does not cover like super PACs and things like this. All right. I haven't looked these numbers up in a while. I don't know if they're still, I think they're actually out of date now. But basically we limit how much you can give to an individual, how much you can give to a political action committee, things like that. The problem is that it still doesn't cover what we call super PACs, which are a little bit different than political action committees. What we end up doing now at this point in time is we organize these political action committees or these super PACs in a manner to where they're not officially tied to the campaign, okay, which affords them the opportunity to operate outside of all of these legal restrictions that are created by the national government. All right, and so when it comes to actual campaign spending for super PACs and things like that, they're supposed to be able to do whatever they want because it's their own private money. They've taken no federal funds, right? And ultimately they get to spend however they see fit. Now, in order to do that, they're not tied in with the campaign, right? So Hillary Clinton had like $500 million in super PACs. Do you think those super PACs didn't talk to the Clinton campaign? Absolutely. Of course they did. I mean, it's illegal, right? But there's also other ways around it because these are individual sort of corporations, right? And the campaign can actually pay the corporation for like a poll, right? So they're allowed to talk to one another so long as it's not related specifically to campaigning, right? To basically telling this super PAC what they're supposed to be running advertisements about. So we end up coming around on lots of instances where we're trying to figure out how to best solve this issue. Okay, so we have the Campaign Reform Act of 2002. You'll sometimes hear about what's BRCA, or the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which is also called the McCain-Feingold Act. All right, but all of these are different things that are trying to stipulate how money is being given, right? How we sort of dictate hard money versus soft money, what they can and cannot do without it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? It becomes, like I said, a long, sort of drawn-out process that becomes very convoluted and difficult to understand. All right? Like I said, this is not my favorite sort of subtopic here to talk about. Right? Money gets a little tricky. All right. Now, what happens is Understand that most of this is related to presidential campaigns because presidential campaigns are what we primarily care about. All right. Presidential candidates can get subsidies. Congressional candidates cannot get subsidies. All right. We haven't really gone over Congress in any great detail, so we don't really know what congressional or what incumbency advantages are. But I know I at least mentioned it at one point. Candidates or congressmen get reelected at a really, really high rate, right? One of the reasons for that is that their challenger, right, doesn't get any sort of federal funds, all right? We don't have limits on spending in congressional races. Again, these are things that were created specifically for presidential races because we view the presidential races being more important, all right? And individuals that are in Congress, sitting congressmen, can spend more time and effort raising money and sort of getting their name out there so that they can spend more when it actually comes time to seek re-election. All right. So there's no limitations on independent expenditures that aren't donated to a party or candidate, but rather spent on behalf of the candidate. So this is what I'm talking about when I say if you don't give the money to the Democratic Party and you don't give the money to Hillary Clinton, but instead it's money that's donated to the Wall Street Loves Hillary Super PAC or whatever, they come up with these ridiculous names, right? But whatever the Super PAC is, okay, then now there's no limitations anymore. Right? And so this is what makes all of this so so difficult to determine, right? I mean, just so you understand, and this probably will not come as a shock, Clinton was under investigation during the last election for how her campaign was collecting and spending money. So was Donald Trump. Right? Because there's so many laws and so many loopholes in all of this that it becomes really difficult to enforce. Right? And so this probably gets into that sort of standpoint in law of if you create too many laws and laws that are too sort of broadly worded, right? Or there's too many loopholes, then the laws ultimately become ineffective and worthless because you cannot enforce them, right? And that's really where we're at. You see it all the time in terms of how our campaigns play out, and it's why one of the things that you should probably actually be able to recognize when you watch a campaign ad, especially in this day and age, do you ever notice what it says at the bottom? Right, like paid for by, and a large percentage of the ads that you're probably watching, it does not say paid for by the campaign to elect Hillary Clinton, right? Instead, it's paid for by, the Teachers Union Super PAC, paid for by whatever, right? Which is, again, how convoluted all of this becomes. This is what I just mentioned before about Gary Johnson, right? So that whole 5%. So you understand, or so you can see, and I mentioned this a second ago, right? We don't take subsidies for the most part anymore because the amount that's subsidized by the national government is so much lower than what candidates can raise on their own, especially at a presidential level, right? And so once you can raise more than what you can get from the national government, there's no point in taking the government's money and then having to abide by spending limitations. All right. Then we'll get into congressional elections as part of our whole voting and electoral concepts here. All right. And so again, this is a little out of place, but we'll go ahead and cover it now. All right. Congressmen, we know how long congressmen serve. How long is House of Representatives? 2 years. All right? Senate is 6 years. Okay? I want you to understand that for the House of Representatives, that becomes even more sort of difficult to deal with. Congressmen actually work less than teachers, right? It's a pretty cushy job, honestly. You don't work a whole lot. Congress is not in session that much. There's actually no penalties whatsoever to not going to work. All right, there are congressmen who do not show up for a week at a time just because they got better things to do, I guess. Right? All that means is that they don't get to vote when actual votes happen because they're not on the floor of the House or the Senate. All right? In the House of Representatives, they'll actually end up spending a significant amount of time campaigning and raising funds for re-election. So if you look at Congress, and we'll talk specifically about the House of Representatives because they're elected for 2 years. Of that 2 years, they might spend a grand total of about 9 or 10 months actually doing their job. All right. The remainder of that time is spent fundraising, campaigning, right, trying to get reelected, and vacationing. All right. So again, pretty cushy job. And the great part about it is once you're in pretty much for life if you want to be. Right. When I taught this in North Carolina, I actually used to show them a picture of their congressman because he made Bernie Sanders look like well-groomed. Right. I mean, he had like his hair was worse than Donald Trump's. He's dead now. Well, I mean, he was really old when I taught. I mean, like this is what 4 years ago. I taught this class in North Carolina. He was a sitting congressman then, and he was actually retiring at that point. But he had been the representative for that district in North Carolina since 1982 or 81. Okay. So and for the record, I taught the district that I was in there was a minority majority district, right? So we haven't gotten to the gerrymandering yet, but we will, because the district that I used to live in North Carolina is that fascinating, like, just ridiculously gerrymandered district that's always used as the example. Because it was basically created to put all the black people in North Carolina together in one district so that they could keep electing the Democrat, and they kept electing the same old white dude. Right? Like I said, he's dead now. So, but he got to be a congressman for a good 30 some odd years. All right. Literally, once you're in, and it was never intended to be this way, but you're pretty much in for life. The state of Arkansas, that's Arkansas, right? Pretty sure tried to limit terms for their congressman. That was struck down as being unconstitutional. So literally, you have people, and I like using Jesse Helms as the example, right? He was I think that's the right name. Was a congressman from South Carolina who was first elected to Congress in the year 1954. Yeah, 1954. Right? What do we know about South Carolina in 1954? It's pretty racist, right? South Carolina 1954, pretty racist. Anybody want to guess what year he stopped serving? 2002. Right? Old white racist dude still in the Senate in the year 2000. Okay? He served in the Senate for 48 years. Think about that for a second. Probably. I don't know. He's South Carolina, not North Carolina. I don't care. The U.S. uses the winner-take-all system, which is detrimental and negatively affects how we do things, which causes problems down the road. Again, like I said, we'll talk about that a lot more with the next unit. With congressional elections, we do have primaries. Honestly, it's difficult to get challenges for primaries. Most people don't care about the congressional primaries. They don't pay attention to it. In fact, most people, when they go to vote, even for congressmen, they don't necessarily know anything about their individual congressman, and they pretty much vote party lines. Okay? I'll be 100% honest with you. When I come to a position and I haven't done my research, I vote for whoever is not the incumbent. Because my philosophy is Congress sucks. So bringing in new people probably can't get any worse than the people that are already there and doing a terrible job. With the primaries, we have closed primaries. This is actually no longer sort of frequent. A lot of states are beginning to open up their primaries, especially in terms of presidential primaries. Some states have different dates for presidential primaries versus other non-presidential primaries. Okay. What you have in an open primary system, independents can vote. Anybody can vote for whoever they want. They get one vote. There are a lot of people who think that this is somewhat problematic. If that's at all possible, this year might have been the issue that would show that with the presidential election. Because obviously when you had open primaries, Bernie Sanders did far better than in instances where you had closed primaries, right? The Democratic establishment like Clinton, the independents like Sanders. You also get people though that will claim, and I don't know how I feel about this, maybe it's ingenious, maybe it's not, but you would have had like a bunch of Democrats that go out and vote for Donald Trump in the primary, right? And the reason being is because they looked at Donald Trump, like I did, and they were like, there's no way that dude can win. No. So if we go up against Donald Trump, we'll win definitively, right? Whereas if we had gone against Rubio or Cruz or Kasich, there was a legitimate fear that the Democrats would have lost there, right? So you actually have instances where people will cross lines in order to vote for what they view as being the worst candidate possible, hoping to make that the candidate for the other party, so that way in a general election you can defeat them at that point. All right. When it comes to re-elections, incumbency, right, and this just means that you're already sitting, so an incumbent is the person who is currently in office. Your incumbent congressman is Pete Olson. Your incumbent senators are Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. All right. All three of those guys will continue to get re-elected for as long as they so desire, maybe with the exception of Ted Cruz, because as Lindsey Graham famously said, if you killed Ted Cruz on the floor of the Senate and the trial were held in the Senate, you wouldn't be convicted. But, all right. So there you go, 90% of congressmen are re-elected, 80+% of senators. All right, this leaves us really with this idea of a permanent Congress. In reality, what you're left with is a very limited number of competitive seats. Okay, so all of these are advantages that they have. Right, franking simply means that they get to mail stuff out for free. That's deemed to be a positive because we want to be able to be informed. So when we created the Constitution many, many years ago, the only way you could inform people is if you mailed them things, they still get free postage. And really what they use it for is re-election stuff, right? They already have a staff in place, which makes it easier for them to spend time doing other things. They can also, they're not supposed to, but they can also use their staff to help get them re-elected, all right? Gerrymandered districts, name recognition, I mean, all of these things build up to making it really hard for somebody else to get voted into office. Alright? So what we have is what we consider what we call various types of elections, right? So when you have an incumbent, it's generally very uncompetitive, alright? You have weak challenger campaigns, so I don't even remember who ran against Pete Olson. He didn't have a chance, alright? Strong challenger elections or campaigns, those are the what we call sort of the swing seats in Congress. Those are the ones that are not safe seats. They're not gerrymandered. You don't have a vast majority of either Republicans or Democrats that are involved. When you have an open seat, meaning that somebody has retired, that gets most competitive, because then you lose any sort of incumbency advantage, right? So even when Pete Olson retires, right, we'll have a fairly competitive race here, even though it will result in another Republican being elected by all means, or in all likelihood, right? If you look at California, California actually saw one of their senators retire this year, and I think it was Barbara Boxer retired. Based on the way California runs their primaries, and their actual Senate general election came down to two candidates. Both of them were Democrats, and because no Republican got enough votes in the primary to even challenge in the general election. Okay, that becomes an incredibly tight race, and the Democratic Party is not going to waste money on it because either way they win. All right. The Senate is more competitive than the House because the House is easier to gerrymander. With midterm elections, the party of the president, they're going to lose seats. And that holds the majority of the time, in fact, the vast majority of the time. There are only a few instances in which it doesn't. 2002 was one of those examples, and in 2002 that did not occur solely because of 9/11. All right, and in all honesty, 9/11 is what changes that, because we view, and the Republicans do a really good job of painting Democrats as being weak on security and safety and military and stuff like that, right? So when we have an attack of that nature happen against us, that bodes well for Republicans, right? So there you go. That's the end of Unit 2.